Actually, there is something I wanted to talk about. LK posted this video. I actually really like this video. LK's YouTube channel, if you're not subscribed, you should. He's got very good content. This is a react to a react, I guess, technically. Oh shit, it's a react to a react to a react.
How do you create emergent gameplay?
I get the concept of emergent gameplay he's talking about is he wants a lot of freedom in the game that's enabled through system mechanics typically. And usually, I guess, from what Alex brought up is, for the most part, basically like even at the cost of unintentional effects. I have a fantastic example. In fact, we're gonna boot up Exerd after this. This concept inherently, emergent gameplay, a lot of people say they want this, but they don't actually want this, all right? And we're gonna get to this.
Having a variety of options and then making the choices in those options constantly, and constantly having things to do is the thing that breeds emergent gameplay. And it's something that I specifically talked about when we were chatting about DNF Duel. And DNF Duel is a game that it probably is going to get figured out pretty fast. However, it does have one really important thing to it. And I said this specific term. It feels loose.
If you look at concepts like Granblue or Street Fighter V or Strive, they all have a very linear kind of progression. Typically, usually what this means is like in a character's win condition or how they get there, right? So typically in Strive, it's very linear, right? It's extremely linear, and that's why typically a lot of people do not like it. Let's compare it to older games. Most of the time in older games, there were a lot of differences that could add to the consistency, but they are also just knowledge checks. And that's kind of the problem with this sort of concept, right? A lot of people really idolize the concept of emergent gameplay. From a casual perspective, you can play it in almost any different way, but the problem is that you basically end up just doing, it essentially means some characters will have options that are so strong at a layer 1. A perfect example of this is Riot Stomp or Grand Viper. Against casuals, Soul players just can do this. They can just do this on a wake up, and like people will get fucking smoked by it. Just that alone. But at higher level, it's basically terrible, right? Like there's like no reason to do it. That sort of concept alone becomes very strong and teaches you how to play the game wrong if you want to progress, right? If you consider yourself a competitive player, these sort of things become kind of pointless. It gets to a point where it's either too strong in general, which means it needs to be nerfed, or it's not strong enough, but it has very situational uses. Typically, if it has very situational uses, it becomes a knowledge check. We're gonna talk about a character that's just a knowledge check.
For example, you can cancel any part of your normal into a special, and that special can be canceled into any other special. So at any point, you can do it. And that's very loose. That's a very loose mechanic that allows for a lot of freedom of the player to do so.
I played a lot of DNF, right? I played the game a ton on release, and I enjoyed it. Like, he's kind of got good points, but he's also, it's kind of bad to use DNF. So DNF, it has this sort of cancel window, but it also has a guard button. This guard button inherently will block a lot of mix-ups, right? Like a lot of them. Even through characters like Crusader, who is on the screen here. And even just playing that, like for the amount of, like the beta, I basically figured out how you play against this character is you just, he RPSs either strike or he tries to shimmy you. But even taking the throw is way better than getting hit. Already, this one character has such a restrictive game plan. You know what I mean? Just inherently, just by playing this game so fast.
Fighting game, you would specifically be only limited to cancel at the beginning part or the end part, right?
So see, like what he's basically talking about is just like combos. Like he's talking about offense and combos, not as much defense or neutral, right?
You ever run into a fighting game and it's very clear that this person is playing like Akuma and then this person is playing Akuma and they play the character almost entirely different? That's an example of a loose fighting.
I mean, look at Strive. Strive inherently, through what, I mean, even through my perception of a fighting game, it's not what I would describe as loose. You know what I mean? It's not. Even characters like Mei, who have shit for all options, right? There's still people who play the character differently, right? Just inherently. That's not a matter of necessarily the system, but the character, like the players behind it.
All of these games that are relatively loose are going to get solved. You know what I mean? They're going to get to a point where they
That's
are
true.
eventually figured out and optimized. That is just the nature of all games, right? People will figure out the best strategies for this situation. But here's the difference. The difference between a fighting game that is loose/emergent and one that is essentially solved/tight is the fact that the games that are solved and tight get figured out really quick.
This is not entirely untrue. Like, obviously, if you look at really old games, like if we're talking like Third Strike or like VSAV or like JoJo's, like all those things, a lot of people did not really share information until then. Like way back, yeah, let's say that shit for national. That was a real like concept back then, right? Like with a lot more people are willing to share information. There's a lot more content creators that are willing to give more advanced concepts. Again, back in like 2015, 2016, even that back then was rare. I'd say like a lot of the content that is very important, honestly, Sajim touched on a lot of it, and a lot of his content is the first to really refer to like a lot of high level ideas and concepts. And that comes to like 2019 or like 2020. How you improved was you watched Japanese footage and you stole what they did. Like there weren't really much other sources. This lady here, Enda Silva, she used to post content like this because they were so rare. Like it was so hard to find people like would post all this content, right? In fact, this is the reason why I started learning Japanese. This is back like what, 5 years ago.
So wait a minute, why are we taking away things from all these characters from the previous game? Why are we taking away things from the previous versions of the game? And now the characters are doing even less stuff than they were doing from 2 versions ago. Like, what is going on? I don't want to go to somebody's stream and watch somebody play a character and then every other stream, people play the character the exact same way.
Basically, the higher level you go, the more you're not going to be able to avoid that. Like, basically, there is a gold standard or a way to consistently follow a character, you know, a more consistent way. Basically, like what this is kind of like, and there's a lot of parallels to it, is like poker. Basically, you can play poker any way you want, casually, and it can, you know, it could be fun. But basically, like the goal is to be consistent, right? Like that's your goal. Some characters inherently are designed to go in some way. Or even for a game like Plus R, I mean, Soul is like a blatant, like mid-range, kind of close-range character. You can play in mid-range or close range, but inherently, the person that plays safer from mid-range to convert into close range is going to be the better player, inherent, because that way is more consistent, right? Just by nature of the character.
DNF Duel immediately has some elements to its combat, which I don't think are perfect, but are very fun. Are super fun at the start. And you know why it's fun? You know why it's fun to a lot of people?
Don't say it. Don't like do the growl thing.
The reason it is because DNF Duel felt...
Again, it seems like Maxley really enjoys the feeling of open-endedness on offense, right? I've thought about this a lot, because this is something like, especially, you know, being a fucking gear boomer, you know, they idolize this sort of thing. I'll give you 2 characters with fantastic examples of this. A lot of people don't learn about Bedman. This is the most interested community I've ever seen in Bedman, but he's a great example. This is how he basically does step play shit to you. He uses the bed slam. He can use this as a free projectile. Right? Now, the problem with this is that this is just a knowledge check, basically. For some reason, here, I'll just replay it and I'll show you. You can run through that. So when you understand that sort of thing, it means that this character basically becomes useless. If you do not know this, and he's just working on you with like, there's 2 knowledge checks to this character inherently. If you do not know these things, this character might as well be top 1. This character will free you up if you don't understand this. Right? So this is kind of the problem with characters like this. Right? There's a lot of complexity to him, but he's invalidated through something where if you understand how he functions, he is basically a useless character. His character design and his system is a little too weak. Even in a version like this, is he zones you from a specific spacing, and he hopes you don't know how to deal with this shit. That's basically it. Let's go back. probably the biggest knowledge check in the game. She has a lot of freedom, right? Like she can do a lot of crazy shit. Essentially, her freedom entirely depends on she can combo from when these minions attack, right? So how do you think you're supposed to deal with this character, right? Like let's say she puts down her huts. How do you think you deal with her? Kill the houses. This is another knowledge check of you have to kill the minions. So let's say if you hit her like this, go for like a combo. This is actually the incorrect thing to do. If you let the houses get stronger over time and she does not actually get opened up, right? They start coming for you, which means if you actually want to fight this character effectively, the only thing you do is when you do a hit like this, you do this. Now, you can see this is kind of a problem when it comes to learning the game, right? She requires you to essentially understand that you do not pick actually doing combo to her. You pick destroying the houses because it's the safest bet. Again, if you don't understand this, she might as well be top 10. But if you know how that's how it works, she becomes one of the worst characters in the game. Because if she does not have consistent minions, all she has is kind of okay buttons, and that's it. Kind of the problem with having characters who are very different or very open-ended, it's that if you make them too strong, that basically her mechanic is just like, it's just there on top of the character, which that's very toxic. When this character released and her buttons, like as good as they were, like basically they didn't have hurt boxes at all, like these two buttons, and it also, minions did not go away when she got hit, so that was another reason to also hit the houses. She was like toxic as fuck and didn't need to use her mechanic. They nerfed her buttons to make her use her mechanic more, which made her more of a knowledge check, which means if she's more of a knowledge check, she's basically just a weak character. There's a set between me and like the top NA Jacko player, Nova, and he just does not get to play. And it's not a matter of like me being godlike over him. It's literally the character's mechanic is so bad that when you understand how to deal with it, she just sucks. Why a lot of people really want these type of characters that are really complex, but they don't understand that they either fall into two categories. They fall under the Raven category, who everybody hates because he doesn't have to use his mechanic as much, or he didn't used to. Raven has a mechanic where he wants you to hit him, and if you hit him, then his moves get buffed, basically. Extremely good at playing neutral, right? And playing like footsies. But his mechanic is not as important. Whereas, if you look at Jacko, Raven does not need his mechanic as much as he has good buttons, right? it's a bonus, right? Jacko's is essential. Raven is he's not top tier, but he's really good. Jacko is ass. Ramlethal has some like essential strings that these are also great examples of a knowledge check. Essentially Tekken strings. This is the most infamous one. This is plus and it gives her a combo. If you understood how to beat this, you could mash out of it in some fucking ham way. This is kind of what a lot of it ended up being. If you can instant block her, then she can't do any of her Rekka shit as easily. Basically, she has a huge barrier of entry on how to run her offense. If you don't, she can just do this all over, like over and over again. This is kind of the problem with these sort of characters. This is a character that her mechanic is not even as prevalent. The more options she has, essentially, the more it's like it's either very good or just very bad. There's no in between. There are very few characters who have a mechanic so strong that it basically bypasses it. All these characters have a shit ton of options, right? But like the actual effectiveness of like half of them is like it might as well not even be in the game. I'll give you another example of like a common trap. All of the Kai players use this shit as an overhead, right? This move is actually supposed to be used to go over buttons, right? People just use it as an overhead, right? So like, there you go. This is like a good example of something like the game's intended purpose for it is not being used properly. It kind of fucks up the process of how people learn a character. People use this like he's a high-low character. So if you get baited into using it like this, you may think he's like a high-low frame trap character, when in actuality, he's essentially just another strike throw character like Soul. Riot's Thumb is like the same way. These two moves, essentially, if you use them improperly, it gives you a bad understanding of actually what the character is supposed to do. Like, you basically only improve by eliminating your usage of them. If you intend to actually improve, you know, this shit is essentially very detrimental to you. That's why I think it's actually great that Strive removed a lot of these things, because there's not very many moves that are like purely useless in the same way. So you have these moves that are basically useless with different moves. It means that there's much more of a, for a lack of a better term, there's a much thicker barrier between each skill level. This is why I kind of don't miss these sort of moves. I'd rather them just be a lot more direct. Think of it from the side of a developer. If you have these sort of moves that directly cause, like, you know, these barriers of entry, you basically end up thinking, you know, do we keep this in to make this more enjoyable for like casuals, or do we like try to fix this to make it better for players who want to improve? These moves, even though they suck, are essentially great against casuals. So these are also barriers of entry to casuals, because they expect you to understand how to beat them. The more you understand these sort of moves, the less that these people can actually enjoy the game, because you just lock them down from actually doing it. They're scrub killer moves, basically. How do you balance a game around all these scrub killing moves that essentially have no real relevancy at high level outside of very few selections, but are so predominantly powerful in low level? You see the problem with all of this. It's basically either you keep them in and you kind of damage your lower level, or you remove them and kind of go from there. Think of this as a new player. If you're struggling with this move and they just do this shit over and over again, you're not gonna have fun. Like, I don't care what kind of world you live in, you will not enjoy someone just doing this shit over and over to you. You don't see the problem with that. That's because you're not a new player anymore. I can tell you from experience in playing this game, this move alone has killed the game for more players than you may actually think. You guys brought up, what if casuals don't care about this? Casuals also don't want to learn this. Do you get the point? Where we've kind of gone to the flip side. We've talked about how easy it is to beat as a top player, and that's why it's also not useful, but it's also kind of problematic, because for low level players, they won't be able to experience the game unless they essentially get past this hurdle. Some casuals will not want to do that. So the more you go down this road, it's more like, of course I don't care about it. I know how to deal with this. I could probably anti-air this shit with my eyes closed. But this move is still a fucking barrier of entry. Why is this different to casuals 6P anti-airs? Because there's a lot more to the game more than just this game. Understanding how to 6P anti-airs, that's a core aspect of this game. Learning to 6P Riot Stomp is not, this is literally just, you learn how to deal with it and that's it. These sort of moves are essentially just barriers to entry. Like, hugely. Are barriers to entry bad? Not necessarily, but the problem is, like, if you want the game to grow, you have to minimize them. The perspective that Max is talking about is, most of the time he's talking about it on offense, which is like, you know, that's common on offense, but the problem with it is that typically it's not restrictive to open, like, you know, more open games. It's basically entirely dependent on how offense or how the system is structured, right? So here's a good example of this. You could argue that on defense, like, you could do some open world shit. You could blitz every time. You can riot stomp every time. You can vortex every time. Like, you have a lot of options. But, like, inherently, there's always going to be a more dominant option, which everyone will lean towards. It doesn't matter how many options you have. You know, that's just how it works. No matter what, you cannot avoid that sort of layout, right? Like, you can't avoid some option being good. It doesn't matter how tight or how loose the game is, right? This is why it's so important to talk about. But I think it's important to at least have a certain amount of options where you understand how you're supposed to progress. Because if you want to take this seriously and you want to get better and you want to enjoy what fighting games are, you have to enjoy the process of losing and winning, honestly. And if you're getting fucked by this, like, again, this gets old.